The sound of her daughter's terrified screams still echoed in Elizabeth's ears as she sat in the emergency room, holding an ice pack to her swollen left eye. 8-year-old Juliet clung to her mother's free hand, her small body trembling as she whispered, "Mommy, why did Daddy hurt you?" The question pierced through Elizabeth's heart like a dagger, because she knew this moment would change everything forever. She had always told herself that Alexander's verbal abuse was just stress from work, that his controlling behavior was just him being protective, but when his fist connected with her face in front of their child, every excuse she had ever made crumbled to dust. It had started 3 hours earlier when Elizabeth came home from her double shift at the diner, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening with Juliet. She found Alexander pacing in their small living room, his face twisted with rage as he clutched a stack of bills in his hand. Before she could even set down her purse, he was yelling about how irresponsible she was, how she never contributed enough to the household, how his sisters were struggling because Elizabeth refused to help them with their rent. "Your sisters live in a house twice the size of ours," Elizabeth had replied, trying to keep her voice calm as Juliet watched cartoons just a few feet away. "They both have jobs, Alexander. We can barely afford our own rent, let alone pay theirs too." That's when his face had turned that familiar shade of red that meant trouble was coming. "You ungrateful witch," he had snarled, moving closer to her. "My sisters took care of me when I had nothing. They deserve our help, and you're going to give it to them whether you like it or not." Elizabeth had stood her ground, something she rarely did anymore. "I worked 16 hours today, Alexander. I'm tired, I'm broke, and I'm not giving money we don't have to people who spend more on their nails than I make in a week." The first slap had come so fast she barely saw it coming. Juliet's cartoon was suddenly drowned out by the sound of Elizabeth's gasp and Alexander's heavy breathing. But it was the second blow, the closed fist punch that sent her stumbling backward into the coffee table, that made Juliet start screaming. "Daddy, stop!" Juliet had cried, jumping up from the couch and running to her mother. "You're hurting Mommy." Alexander had looked at his daughter with wild eyes, as if he was seeing her for the first time. For a moment, Elizabeth thought he might apologize, might realize what he had done. Instead, he had grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, leaving Elizabeth bleeding on the floor and Juliet crying hysterically. Now, 3 hours later, Elizabeth sat in the sterile hospital room and finally admitted to herself what she had been denying for months. This wasn't the first time Alexander had hit her, but it was the first time Juliet had witnessed it. The doctor had documented her injuries, asked the standard questions about domestic violence, and given her pamphlets about shelters and support groups. But Elizabeth wasn't thinking about shelters or support groups. She was thinking about revenge. The nurse, an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair, had pulled Elizabeth aside while Juliet was getting a juice box from the vending machine. "Honey," she had said gently, "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've seen too many women come through these doors. The ones who survive, who really make it out, they're the ones who get smart about it. Don't just leave. Make sure he can't do this to anyone else ever again." Those words kept replaying in Elizabeth's mind as she drove home with Juliet, who had finally fallen asleep in the back seat. Alexander's car wasn't in the driveway, which meant he was probably at his sister's house, telling them his version of what happened. They would comfort him, tell him that Elizabeth had it coming, that she needed to learn her place. His sisters, Isabella and Carmen, had never liked Elizabeth from the moment Alexander brought her home 5 years ago. They saw her as an outsider, someone who was stealing their precious brother away from them. Elizabeth had tried to be the perfect sister-in-law at first. She had cooked for family gatherings, babysat their children, even lent them money when they claimed to be struggling. But nothing was ever enough. They criticized her cooking, her clothes, her job, her parenting. When Elizabeth and Alexander got married, they had actually tried to talk him out of it, claiming she wasn't good enough for their family. As Elizabeth carried Juliet inside their small house, she noticed the stack of bills Alexander had been holding earlier scattered on the floor. She gathered them up, her hands shaking with anger as she read through them. The rent was 3 weeks overdue, the electricity was about to be shut off, and they had $17 in their checking account. But somehow, Alexander had been giving his sisters money for their rent, money that should have been going to keep their own family afloat. Elizabeth put Juliet to bed, kissing her forehead and promising that everything would be okay. As she sat alone in the living room, she made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to file for divorce and disappear into the night like a beaten dog. She wasn't going to let Alexander and his sisters win. She was going to destroy them systematically and completely, using their own weaknesses against them. The first step was gathering information. Elizabeth knew that Alexander's sisters weren't as innocent as they pretended to be. Isabella claimed to be a single mother struggling to make ends meet, but Elizabeth had seen her driving different expensive cars and wearing designer clothes. Carmen supposedly worked part-time at a beauty salon, but she was always traveling and posting pictures of expensive restaurants on social media. There was something shady about their finances, and Elizabeth was going to find out what it was. She also knew that Alexander had been acting strange lately, coming home late and being secretive about his phone. At first, she had attributed it to work stress, but now she wondered if there was more to it. If he was cheating on her, that would make her revenge even sweeter. Elizabeth looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror, at the bruise that was already forming around her eye, and made a promise to herself. Alexander and his sisters had no idea what they had just unleashed. They thought they were dealing with a weak, submissive woman who would take whatever they dished out. They were about to learn how wrong they were. As she prepared for bed, Elizabeth began mentally planning her next moves. She would need allies, evidence, and most importantly, patience. This wouldn't be a quick process, but it would be thorough. By the time she was done, Alexander would regret ever laying a hand on her, and his sisters would wish they had never been born. The last thing Elizabeth did before falling asleep was to take a picture of her bruised face with her phone. It was the first piece of evidence in what would become a very long and satisfying case of revenge. Alexander and his sisters had started a war they couldn't win, and Elizabeth was going to make sure they knew it. The next morning brought a pounding headache and the harsh reality of what Elizabeth's life had become. Juliet was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed staring at her mother's bruised face with wide, frightened eyes. Elizabeth forced a smile and told her daughter they were going to have a special breakfast at the diner where she worked, knowing that her boss Linda would understand if she needed to bring Juliet along. Alexander still wasn't home, which suited Elizabeth just fine. She needed time to think, to plan, and to figure out exactly what she was dealing with. As she got Juliet ready for their day out, she made mental notes of everything she would need to do. First, she needed to find out exactly where their money was going. Second, she needed to understand what Alexander's sisters were really up to. And third, she needed to figure out why her husband had been acting so strange lately. The diner was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few regulars nursing their coffee and reading newspapers. Linda took one look at Elizabeth's face and immediately ushered her and Juliet into the back office, closing the door behind them. Linda was a tough woman in her 50s who had raised 3 kids as a single mother and didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. "What did that fool do to you?" Linda asked, her voice tight with anger as she examined Elizabeth's bruised face. "It's complicated," Elizabeth began, but Linda cut her off. "It's not complicated at all. He hit you, and from the look of things, it wasn't the first time. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Elizabeth had always trusted Linda, and something about the older woman's direct approach made her want to tell the truth. "I'm going to make him pay," she said quietly, glancing at Juliet who was coloring at the small table in the corner. "But I need help." Linda leaned forward, her expression serious. "What kind of help?" "I need to find out what he's been doing with our money, and I need to know if he's cheating on me. I have suspicions, but I need proof." Linda was quiet for a moment, then reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "My nephew Tony is a private investigator. He's good, he's discreet, and he owes me a favor. Call him." Elizabeth took the card, feeling a surge of hope for the first time in months. "Thank you, Linda. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You'll repay me by making sure that man never hurts you or Juliet again. Now you and Juliet stay here today. Help me with the lunch rush and I'll pay you double. Consider it an investment in your future." The morning passed quickly, and Elizabeth found herself feeling more focused and determined than she had in years. Every time she caught sight of her reflection in the diner's windows, the bruise on her face reminded her of why she was doing this. She called Tony during her break, and he agreed to meet her that evening after Juliet was asleep. Around noon, Elizabeth was serving coffee to a table of construction workers when she noticed a familiar figure outside the diner's windows. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who lived next door to them. She was gesturing frantically and seemed to be trying to get Elizabeth's attention. Elizabeth finished serving the table and stepped outside, where Mrs. Rodriguez immediately grabbed her arm. "Mija, I need to talk to you. It's about your husband and those sisters of his." Mrs. Rodriguez was in her 70s, a tiny woman with silver hair and sharp eyes who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. She knew everyone and everything that happened on their street, and she had never liked Alexander or his sisters. "What about them?" Elizabeth asked, though she had a feeling she didn't want to know the answer. I saw him come home this morning around 6, but he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, a tall woman with red hair. They went inside together and she didn't come out until almost 9 o'clock. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. She had suspected Alexander was cheating, but having it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. Did you recognize her? No, but I got a good look at her car. It's a silver Honda with a dent in the back bumper. I wrote down the license plate number. Mrs. Rodriguez handed Elizabeth a piece of paper with shaky handwriting. There's more, Mija. I've been watching those sisters of his for months, and something's not right about them. What do you mean? Mrs. Rodriguez looked around nervously, then leaned closer. They're running some kind of business out of that house. Different people coming and going at all hours, always paying cash. And they're getting mail for at least 6 different names. I think they're up to something illegal. Elizabeth felt a spark of excitement. If Alexander's sisters were involved in something illegal, that could be the key to destroying them. Mrs. Rodriguez, would you be willing to help me gather evidence about what they're doing? The older woman's eyes lit up. Mija, I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for months. Those women are trouble and they're bringing down the whole neighborhood. I'll help you any way I can. They spent the next 20 minutes talking, with Mrs. Rodriguez sharing everything she had observed about Isabella and Carmen's activities. The more Elizabeth heard, the more convinced she became that the sisters were involved in some kind of fraud or illegal business operation. When Elizabeth returned to the diner, she found a text message from Alexander on her phone. Sorry about last night. We need to talk. Coming home around 6. Elizabeth stared at the message, feeling a mixture of disgust and satisfaction. He was sorry, but only because he had been caught. He probably thought he could smooth things over with a few apologetic words and maybe some flowers the way he always did. But this time would be different. This time, Elizabeth would be ready for him. The afternoon passed in a blur of serving customers and planning her next moves. Tony, the private investigator, had agreed to meet her at 8 p.m. at a coffee shop across town. She would give him the license plate number and hire him to investigate both the woman and Alexander's sisters. Linda had offered to watch Juliet, claiming she needed help with inventory anyway. As closing time approached, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she was in control of her own life. Alexander and his sisters had no idea what was coming for them, and Elizabeth intended to keep it that way. The last customer of the day was a young woman with short black hair and tired eyes. She ordered coffee and pie but barely touched either. Something about her seemed familiar, but Elizabeth couldn't place her. As the woman was leaving, she turned back to Elizabeth with a worried expression. Are you okay? She asked, looking at Elizabeth's bruised face. I know it's not my business, but if you need help, there are people who can help you. Elizabeth was touched by the stranger's concern, but she managed a smile. Thank you, but I'm going to be fine. Better than fine, actually. As Elizabeth watched the woman walk away, she felt another surge of determination. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for Juliet, for Mrs. Rodriguez, for Linda, and for every other woman who had ever been hurt by men like Alexander. This was about more than revenge now. This was about justice. The drive home was quiet, with Juliet sleeping in the back seat and Elizabeth's mind racing with possibilities. She had allies now, people who were willing to help her fight back. She had evidence and leads to follow. Most importantly, she had a plan. Alexander's car was in the driveway when they arrived, and Elizabeth could see him through the kitchen window, pacing back and forth while talking on his phone. He looked agitated and kept running his hands through his hair, which usually meant he was dealing with some kind of problem. Good, Elizabeth thought as she carried Juliet inside. Let him sweat a little bit. Let him wonder what's coming next. She was about to find out just how much trouble Alexander and his sisters were really in, and she was going to make sure they paid for every single lie they had ever told, every dollar they had stolen, and every bruise they had caused. The war had officially begun. Alexander was waiting in the kitchen when Elizabeth walked in, his face a mask of forced remorse that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had clearly rehearsed what he was going to say, probably with coaching from his sisters, and Elizabeth could see the calculation behind his apologetic expression. Elizabeth, baby, I'm so sorry about last night, he began, moving toward her with his arms outstretched. I don't know what came over me. The stress from work, the bills, everything just got to me and I lost control. Elizabeth stepped back, keeping Juliet behind her. Don't touch me, Alexander. And don't you dare blame this on stress or bills or anything else. You hit me in front of our daughter. I know, and I feel terrible about it. Look, I brought you something. He gestured toward the counter, where a small bouquet of grocery store flowers sat next to a box of chocolates. "I want to make this right, Elizabeth. We can get through this together." Elizabeth stared at the pathetic offering, remembering all the times before when flowers and chocolates had been enough to make her forgive him. Not anymore. "Juliet, go to your room and play with your toys. Mommy needs to talk to Daddy." Once Juliet was safely out of earshot, Elizabeth turned back to Alexander with ice in her voice. "You think some cheap flowers are going to fix this? You think I'm just going to forget that you beat me up because I wouldn't give money to your precious sisters?" Alexander's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. "They're family, Elizabeth. Family comes first, and if you can't understand that, then maybe you're not the woman I thought you were. Where were you last night, Alexander? After you stormed out of here, where did you go?" "I went to Isabella's house. I needed to talk to someone who understood what I was going through." Elizabeth nodded, filing away his lie for later use. She knew he had been with another woman, but she wasn't ready to confront him about that yet. She needed more evidence first. "And what about this morning? You didn't come home until after Juliet left for school." "I stayed at Isabella's. I needed time to think, to figure out how to make things right with you." Another lie. Elizabeth could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his hands fidgeted with his keys. He was nervous, which meant he knew he was caught in something bigger than just domestic violence. "Alexander, I want to make our marriage work," Elizabeth said, forcing herself to sound sincere. "But I need to understand what's been going on with our finances. We're 3 weeks behind on rent, but somehow your sisters never seem to have money problems. How is that possible?" Alexander's expression shifted, becoming defensive. "My sisters work hard for their money. Just because they're successful doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong. I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong. I'm saying I want to understand where our money is going. If we're going to stay together, we need to be honest with each other about everything." Elizabeth could see the wheels turning in Alexander's head. He was trying to decide how much to tell her, how much he could get away with hiding. Finally, he sighed and sat down at the kitchen table. "Look, I've been helping Isabella and Carmen with some business investments. Nothing major, just lending them money when they need it for their rental properties." "Rental properties? I thought Isabella worked at the grocery store and Carmen worked at the beauty salon." "They do, but they also buy houses and rent them out. It's a side business. They've been really successful at it." Elizabeth nodded, pretending to be impressed. "That's amazing. I had no idea they were such smart businesswomen. Maybe they could teach me about real estate investing." Alexander looked uncomfortable. "It's complicated, Elizabeth. They've been doing this for years and they have their own system. I don't think they'd want to bring anyone else into it. Not even family? Not even your wife? It's not personal, it's just business. They keep it separate from family stuff." Elizabeth could see that Alexander was getting more nervous by the minute. Whatever his sisters were involved in, it was something they wanted to keep secret. That made it even more interesting to her. "Well, maybe you could ask them," Elizabeth said sweetly. "I'm really interested in learning how to make extra money. With Juliet getting older, she's going to need more things and I want to be able to provide for her." Alexander stood up abruptly. "I'll talk to them about it. But right now, I need to focus on making things right between us. Elizabeth, I love you and Juliet more than anything in the world. Last night was a mistake and it will never happen again. I promise." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I want to believe you, Alexander. But you have to understand I'm scared. I'm scared of what happens the next time you get angry, the next time you think I'm not supporting your family enough." "There won't be a next time," Alexander said firmly. "I'm going to get help. I'm going to talk to someone about managing my anger." "That's a good start," Elizabeth said, though she had no intention of giving him the chance to hurt her again. "But I need some time to think about everything. Maybe you should stay at Isabella's for a few more days, just until I can process what happened." Alexander looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Elizabeth's tone stopped him. "If that's what you need, then okay. But I want to see Juliet every day. She's my daughter too." "Of course. You can pick her up from school tomorrow and spend the afternoon with her. Just bring her back by dinner time." After Alexander left, Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. She had successfully planted the seeds of her plan, making him think she was considering reconciliation while actually gathering information about his sister's business activities. Now she needed to follow through on her meeting with Tony, the private investigator. Linda had agreed to watch Juliet for the evening, claiming she needed help organizing her recipe collection. Elizabeth knew it was just an excuse to help her, and she was grateful for the older woman's support. The coffee shop where she was meeting Tony was in a part of town she rarely visited, full of small businesses and quiet streets. She found him sitting in a corner booth, a man in his 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes. He looked exactly like what she had imagined a private investigator would look like. "You must be Elizabeth," he said, standing up as she approached. "Linda told me a little bit about your situation. I'm sorry you're going through this." "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice," Elizabeth said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I need help and I need it fast." Tony pulled out a small notebook and pen. "Tell me everything, starting from the beginning." Elizabeth spent the next hour telling him about Alexander's abuse, his sister's suspicious activities, and her suspicions about an affair. She gave him the license plate number Mrs. Rodriguez had written down, along with everything she knew about Isabella and Carmen's supposed rental business. "This is a lot to unpack," Tony said when she finished. "But I think we can definitely help you. The license plate number is a good start. I can have that information by tomorrow morning. As for the sisters, what you're describing sounds like it could be rental fraud, welfare fraud, or possibly something involving immigration issues." Immigration issues? If they're claiming to be single mothers or low-income individuals to get government benefits, but they're actually running a profitable business, that's fraud. If they're also here illegally or helping other people stay here illegally, that's even more serious. Elizabeth felt a thrill of excitement. "How do we find out for sure?" "I have contacts at various agencies who can run background checks and look into their financial records. It might take a few days, but I should be able to get you some answers. In the meantime, I want you to be very careful. If these people are involved in something illegal, they might not take kindly to being investigated." "I understand. What do you need from me?" "Keep doing what you're doing. Act like you're considering reconciliation with your husband, but document everything. Record conversations if you can do it safely. Take pictures of any documents you can find. And most importantly, don't let them know you suspect anything." Elizabeth left the coffee shop feeling more hopeful than she had in months. She had professional help now and she was starting to understand the scope of what she was dealing with. Alexander and his sisters weren't just bullies, they were criminals. And criminals always made mistakes eventually. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up to a text message from Tony. "The car is registered to Rebecca Martinez, 34, works at Hoffman Industries downtown. Same company as your husband. We'll have more information this afternoon." Elizabeth stared at the message, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. So Alexander was cheating on her with a coworker. That explained the late nights, the secretive phone calls, and the guilty behavior. It also gave her another weapon to use against him. She was just getting Juliet ready for school when her phone rang. It was Alexander. "Elizabeth, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about wanting to learn about real estate investing. I talked to Isabella, and she said she'd be willing to meet with you this afternoon to discuss it." Elizabeth smiled. "Perfect. That's wonderful, Alexander. I really appreciate you asking her. She wants to meet at her house around 2 p.m. I'll be there too, just to help facilitate the conversation." "That sounds perfect. I'm looking forward to learning more about their business." As Elizabeth hung up the phone, she realized that Isabella was making a crucial mistake. She was going to let Elizabeth into her house, where she could see firsthand what kind of operation they were running. It was exactly the kind of break Elizabeth had been hoping for. The trap was being set, and Alexander's sisters were walking right into it. Elizabeth spent the morning preparing for her visit to Isabella's house like a spy preparing for a mission. She charged her phone completely, downloaded a recording app, and practiced looking interested and naive. She also called Tony to let him know about the meeting, and he gave her specific things to look for and questions to ask. "Try to get them to show you financial records, rental agreements, anything with numbers on it," Tony had advised. "And pay attention to how many people seem to be living there. If they're claiming to be single mothers but there are men's clothes around, that's a red flag." Elizabeth dropped Juliet off at school and then stopped by Linda's diner to kill time before the meeting. She found Linda in the back office, going through receipts and muttering about tax season. "How did it go with the private investigator?" Linda asked, looking up from her paperwork. "Better than I expected. He's already identified the woman Alexander's been cheating with, and he thinks Isabella and Carmen might be involved in some kind of fraud." Linda leaned back in her chair with a satisfied expression. "I knew those women were trouble the first time I saw them. They came in here once about 6 months ago, complaining about everything and demanding free food because they claimed the service was slow. I told them to pay their bill and leave, and they haven't been back since. I'm meeting with Isabella this afternoon. She's going to tell me about her real estate business." Be careful, Elizabeth. If they're running some kind of scam, they might be dangerous. Elizabeth nodded, but she wasn't really worried about physical danger. Isabella and Carmen were bullies, but they were also cowards. They used manipulation and intimidation to get what they wanted, but they wouldn't risk doing anything that might bring attention to whatever illegal activities they were involved in. At 1:45 p.m., Elizabeth drove to Isabella's house, a large 2-story home in a neighborhood that was definitely above what someone working at a grocery store should be able to afford. The house was painted bright yellow with white trim, and there were 3 cars in the driveway: Isabella's red SUV, Carmen's black sedan, and a pickup truck Elizabeth didn't recognize. Alexander met her at the front door, looking nervous and fidgety. "Elizabeth, I'm so glad you could make it. Isabella is really excited to talk to you about the business." "I'm excited too," Elizabeth said, forcing a smile. "I've been thinking about this all morning." Isabella appeared behind Alexander, wearing expensive-looking clothes and jewelry that definitely didn't come from a grocery store salary. She was a tall woman with dark hair and sharp features, and she looked at Elizabeth with barely concealed disdain. "Elizabeth, welcome to my home," Isabella said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm so happy that you're finally taking an interest in building wealth for your family." Elizabeth bit back her first response and instead said, "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I know you're very busy." Carmen emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries. She was shorter than Isabella but equally well-dressed, with highlighted hair and manicured nails. "Elizabeth, it's so good to see you looking better. Alexander told us about your little accident the other night." "Little accident?" Elizabeth felt her blood boil, but she kept her expression neutral. "These things happen. I'm just glad Juliet wasn't hurt." The 3 women sat in Isabella's living room, which was decorated with expensive furniture and artwork. Elizabeth noticed several framed photos of Isabella and Carmen with different men, but no children visible anywhere despite their claims of being single mothers. "So," Isabella began, "Alexander tells me you're interested in learning about real estate investing. It's not for everyone, you understand. It requires a certain level of sophistication and business acumen." "I'm willing to learn," Elizabeth said humbly. "I know I don't have much business experience, but I'm a hard worker and I'm good with numbers." Isabella and Carmen exchanged a look that Elizabeth pretended not to notice. They were clearly deciding how much to tell her, probably debating whether she was smart enough to be useful or stupid enough to be taken advantage of. "Well," Carmen said, "we started small, just renting out rooms in our houses to help with the mortgage payments. But then we realized there was a much bigger opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" Elizabeth asked, leaning forward with interest. "We buy houses in certain neighborhoods, houses that the previous owners couldn't afford anymore," Isabella explained. "Then we rent them out to people who need temporary housing arrangements." "Temporary housing arrangements?" "People who are between permanent situations," Carmen added. "People who need a place to stay while they're getting their lives together." Elizabeth nodded, though she was starting to understand what they were really talking about. They were running some kind of boarding house operation, probably renting rooms to undocumented immigrants or people who couldn't pass credit checks for regular apartments. "That sounds like a wonderful way to help people," Elizabeth said. "How do you find these tenants?" "Word of mouth mostly," Isabella said. "We have a reputation in the community for being fair and understanding." "And the business is profitable?" "Very profitable," Carmen said, pulling out her phone to show Elizabeth a photo. "This is one of our properties. We rent out 6 rooms and each tenant pays us $800 a month." Elizabeth did the math quickly. 6 rooms at $800 each meant they were making almost $5,000 a month from just one house. If they owned multiple properties, they could be making tens of thousands of dollars a month. "That's incredible," Elizabeth said. "How many properties do you own?" "For right now," Isabella said proudly. "And we're looking at buying 2 more next month." "How do you afford to buy so many houses?" Isabella and Carmen exchanged another look, and Elizabeth could see them debating how much to reveal. Finally, Isabella spoke up. "We've been very good at working with the system. There are government programs that help people like us buy investment properties, especially if you know how to present your situation correctly." Elizabeth was starting to understand. They were probably lying on their loan applications, claiming to be low-income single mothers while actually running a profitable business. That would explain how they could afford expensive cars and clothes while supposedly working minimum wage jobs. "Could you show me one of your properties?" Elizabeth asked. "I learn better when I can see things in person." Isabella hesitated. "Our properties are occupied right now," and we don't like to disturb our tenants. Of course I understand. But maybe just a quick drive-by? I'd love to see the kind of neighborhoods you invest in. Carmen stood up suddenly. I need to make a phone call. Business never stops, you know? She disappeared into another room, and Elizabeth could hear her speaking in rapid Spanish to someone on the phone. Elizabeth, Isabella said, leaning forward with a confidential air, I want to be honest with you. This business isn't just about buying and selling houses. It's about understanding people, understanding their needs, and being able to provide solutions that work for everyone. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes our tenants need more than just a place to live. They need help with paperwork, with understanding how things work in this country, with navigating systems that can be very complicated for people who are new here. Elizabeth nodded, beginning to understand the full scope of what Isabella and Carmen were doing. They weren't just running boarding houses, they were running some kind of immigration assistance scam, probably charging desperate people for help with documents and legal processes. Carmen returned from her phone call looking agitated. Isabella, we need to talk. She glanced at Elizabeth and Alexander. Privately. Of course, Isabella said, standing up. Elizabeth, why don't you and Alexander wait here for a moment? We'll be right back. As soon as the sisters left the room, Alexander turned to Elizabeth with an uncomfortable expression. What do you think? Are you interested in getting involved? It sounds very complicated, Elizabeth said carefully. Much more complicated than I expected. Isabella and Carmen are very smart business. Retry. Sisi. Continue. Edit. Women, Alexander said, but Elizabeth could hear the uncertainty in his voice. They built something really impressive here. Elizabeth nodded, pretending to consider it while actually listening to the heated conversation taking place in the next room. She could hear Isabella and Carmen arguing in Spanish, their voices getting louder and more agitated. She caught a few words, problemas, dinero, and policia, that made her heart race with excitement. When the sisters returned, their fake smiles were back in place, but Elizabeth could see the tension in their shoulders and the worry in their eyes. Elizabeth, Isabella said, we've decided that we'd like to start you off slowly. Maybe you could help us with some of the paperwork side of the business, learn how we keep track of everything. That sounds perfect, Elizabeth said. I'm very good with paperwork and organization. Excellent. Carmen will call you tomorrow to set up a time to go over our filing system. For now, though, I think we should call it a day. We have some other business to attend to. Elizabeth could tell she was being dismissed, but she had already learned more than she had hoped. As Alexander walked her to her car, she could see that he was troubled about something. Is everything okay? She asked. You seem worried. It's nothing, Alexander said quickly. Just some business complications. Isabella and Carmen handle everything, so I don't need to worry about the details. Elizabeth nodded, filing away his obvious lie. Whatever was going on, Alexander was definitely involved and he was definitely worried about it. On the drive home, Elizabeth called Tony to report what she had learned. They're running multiple scams, she told him. Immigration fraud, rental fraud, probably loan fraud too. And I think they're in some kind of trouble right now. What makes you say that? They got a phone call while I was there and it clearly upset them. They were arguing in Spanish about problems, money, and police. That's very interesting. I should have more information about their background checks by tomorrow. In the meantime, I want you to be extra careful. If they're feeling pressured by law enforcement, they might do something desperate. Elizabeth spent the evening helping Juliet with homework and thinking about her next moves. She had gained Isabella and Carmen's trust enough to get invited back, which meant she would have more opportunities to gather evidence. She also had confirmation that Alexander was involved in whatever illegal activities they were running. The next morning brought a call from Carmen, who sounded much more friendly than she had the day before. Elizabeth, I was thinking we could meet this afternoon to go over some of our paperwork. Would 2 p.m. work for you? That would be perfect, Elizabeth said. Should I meet you at Isabella's house? Actually, let's meet at my house instead. I have most of the filing systems set up in my home office. Elizabeth agreed, excited about the opportunity to see Carmen's setup. She spent the morning getting Juliet ready for school and preparing for her afternoon spy mission. At 1:30 p.m., she received a text from Tony. Background checks reveal both sisters have been using multiple identities for loan applications. Isabella has been married 3 times, always to men who later filed for bankruptcy. Carmen has outstanding warrants in 2 states. Be extremely careful. Elizabeth stared at the message, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. She was dealing with career criminals, people who had been running scams for years. But she was also getting closer to having enough evidence to destroy them completely. Carmen's house was smaller than Isabella's but equally expensive looking. She met Elizabeth at the door wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase, clearly trying to look professional and trustworthy. "Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming. I really think you're going to be a valuable addition to our team." "I'm excited to learn everything I can," Elizabeth said, following Carmen into a small room set up as an office. The room was filled with filing cabinets, computers, and stacks of paperwork. Carmen gestured to a chair in front of the desk while she sat down behind it. "Now the key to our success is organization," Carmen began. "We keep detailed records of everything, every property, every tenant, every expense, every payment." She pulled out a large binder and opened it to show Elizabeth pages of rental agreements, payment records, and tenant information. Elizabeth tried to memorize as much as possible while pretending to be impressed by the organization. "This is incredible," Elizabeth said. "You must have dozens of tenants." 43 right now," Carmen said proudly. "And we're always getting new referrals." Elizabeth noticed that many of the tenant names appeared to be Hispanic, and several of the addresses were the same. They were definitely packing multiple people into single rooms, probably charging each person full rent while telling the landlords they were single-family occupants. "How do you advertise for tenants?" Elizabeth asked. "We don't need to advertise. People know about us in the community. They come to us when they need help." Carmen spent the next hour showing Elizabeth different aspects of their record-keeping system. Elizabeth saw rental agreements for properties she was certain Isabella and Carmen didn't own, tenant records with obviously fake social security numbers, and payment records that didn't match up with the rental amounts they had claimed. "Carmen, can I ask you something?" Elizabeth said as their meeting was wrapping up. "Yesterday at Isabella's house, you seemed upset after that phone call. Is everything okay with the business?" Carmen's expression darkened. "Sometimes we have to deal with people who don't understand how business works. People who think they can take advantage of us because we're women." "What kind of people?" "Government people, mostly. They like to ask questions about things that aren't their business, you know? But we have lawyers, we have accountants, we know how to handle these situations." Elizabeth nodded sympathetically. "That must be very stressful." "It is, but that's why we need smart people like you working with us. The more legitimate business partners we have, the better it looks when people start asking questions." Elizabeth realized that Carmen was essentially asking her to be a front for their illegal activities. They wanted to use her clean record and innocent appearance to make their operation look more legitimate. "I understand," Elizabeth said. "I want to help however I can." As she was leaving, Carmen handed her a thick folder. "These are some rental agreements for you to review. Study them carefully, and we'll talk more tomorrow about how you can get involved." Elizabeth drove home with the folder on her passenger seat, feeling like she had just struck gold. She had detailed records of their illegal operation, evidence of tenant fraud, and proof that they were using fake identities for their business dealings. That evening, she met with Tony at a different coffee shop to turn over the evidence she had gathered. He looked through the folder with growing excitement. "Elizabeth, this is exactly what we needed. These rental agreements are clearly fraudulent, and the tenant information shows they're definitely running an illegal boarding house operation. Combined with the background checks showing their history of identity fraud, we have enough evidence to bring down their entire operation. What's our next step? I'm going to take this information to a contact I have at the FBI. They've been looking into immigration fraud rings in this area, and this fits the profile perfectly. In the meantime, I want you to keep playing along with them, but don't take any money and don't sign anything. We need to make sure you're not legally implicated in any of their activities." Elizabeth felt a surge of triumph. She had done it. She had infiltrated their operation and gathered enough evidence to destroy them. But she wasn't done yet. She still needed to deal with Alexander and his affair, and she wanted to make sure his sister's downfall was as public and humiliating as possible. "Tony, I want them to know that I'm the one who brought them down. When this all comes out, I want them to understand that they messed with the wrong woman." Tony smiled grimly. "Don't worry, Elizabeth. By the time we're done, everyone will know exactly who Elizabeth Johnson is and what happens to people who cross her." As Elizabeth drove home, she thought about Juliet sleeping peacefully in her bed, unaware that her mother was about to turn their world upside down. But it would be worth it. Juliet would grow up knowing that her mother was strong enough to fight back, smart enough to win, and brave enough to protect her family no matter what it cost. The war was about to reach its climax, and Elizabeth was ready for victory. Elizabeth spent the next morning reviewing the evidence Tony had helped her gather, organizing it into a comprehensive file that would destroy Alexander and his sisters completely. She had rental fraud, immigration fraud, identity theft, and adultery all documented with photos, recordings, and official records. But she wanted her first strike to be memorable, something that would send a message that she was no longer the victim in this situation. The opportunity came when Alexander called her around noon, sounding more nervous than usual. "Elizabeth, I need to ask you a favor. The company Christmas party is this Friday night, and I really need you to come with me. Some of the executives will be there, and it would look bad if I showed up alone." Elizabeth smiled to herself. "Perfect. Of course, Alexander. I think it would be good for us to be seen together as a couple. Are you picking me up or should I meet you there?" "I'll pick you up at 7. And Elizabeth? Thank you for being so understanding about everything. I know things have been difficult lately, but I really think we can work through this." "I'm looking forward to it," Elizabeth said, and she meant it. She spent the afternoon shopping for a dress for the party, choosing something elegant but not too flashy. She also stopped by a print shop to have some special materials prepared for the evening. Tony had given her additional information about Rebecca Martinez, the woman Alexander was having an affair with, including her job title and department at the company. Friday evening arrived with Elizabeth feeling calm and focused. She had dropped Juliet off at Linda's house for a sleepover, telling her daughter they were going to have a special girls' night with movies and popcorn. Juliet was excited about the adventure, completely unaware of what her mother was planning. Alexander arrived at 7 sharp, looking handsome in his best suit and clearly trying to make a good impression. He complimented Elizabeth on her dress and helped her into the car, playing the part of the devoted husband perfectly. "You look beautiful tonight," he said as they drove to the hotel where the party was being held. "I'm proud to have you as my wife." Elizabeth smiled and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Alexander. I'm proud to be here with you too." The hotel ballroom was decorated with twinkling lights and Christmas trees, filled with Alexander's co-workers and their families. Elizabeth recognized some faces from previous company events, including Alexander's boss, Mr. Henderson, who had always been friendly to her. "Elizabeth, how wonderful to see you," Mr. Henderson said, approaching them with a warm smile. "Alexander's been telling me how supportive you've been during his recent promotion review." "Oh, it's been my pleasure," Elizabeth said sweetly. "I always support my husband's career ambitions." Alexander looked uncomfortable at the mention of his promotion review, and Elizabeth filed that information away for later use. Clearly, his relationship with Rebecca was affecting his professional standing. They made their way through the crowd, with Alexander introducing Elizabeth to various colleagues and executives. Elizabeth was charming and gracious, playing the perfect corporate wife while secretly studying the room and identifying key players in what was about to unfold. About an hour into the party, Elizabeth excused herself to go to the restroom, but instead made her way to the hotel's business center. She had called ahead to arrange for use of their presentation equipment, claiming she wanted to surprise her husband with a special tribute. The hotel staff was incredibly helpful, setting up a laptop and projector in the ballroom while Elizabeth uploaded her presentation. She had titled it, "A Tribute to My Husband Alexander," and she made sure it would be quite a tribute indeed. When she returned to the party, she found Alexander talking to a tall woman with red hair who matched the description of Rebecca Martinez. They were standing close together, their body language clearly indicating an intimate relationship, while Alexander's wedding ring glinted in the light. "Alexander," Elizabeth said, approaching them with a bright smile. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" Alexander's face went pale. "Elizabeth, this is Rebecca Martinez from the marketing department." "Rebecca, this is my wife, Elizabeth." Rebecca looked equally uncomfortable, clearly recognizing Elizabeth's name from whatever Alexander had told her about their marriage problems. "Nice to meet you," she said stiffly. "Oh, the pleasure is all mine," Elizabeth said warmly. "Alexander has told me so much about his co-workers. It's wonderful to put faces to names." The conversation was awkward and brief, with Rebecca making an excuse to leave as soon as possible. Alexander watched her go with longing in his eyes, apparently forgetting that his wife was standing right next to him. "She seems lovely," Elizabeth said casually. "Very pretty too." "She's just a colleague," Alexander said quickly. "Nothing more than that." "Of course," Elizabeth agreed. "I trust you completely." As the evening progressed, Elizabeth watched Alexander and Rebecca trying to avoid each other while still stealing glances across the room. It was almost comical how obvious they were being, and Elizabeth wondered how long their affair had been going on before she found out about it. At 9 p.m., the hotel staff dimmed the lights and announced that there would be a special presentation. Elizabeth stood up and made her way to the front of the room, where a microphone had been set up. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "I wanted to take a moment to share something special with all of you tonight. My husband Alexander and I have been married for 5 years, and I thought it would be nice to show everyone what our life together has been like." Alexander looked confused but pleased, probably thinking Elizabeth was about to give a heartwarming speech about their marriage. The crowd settled in to watch, expecting a typical corporate party presentation. Elizabeth clicked the first slide, which showed a beautiful photo of her and Alexander on their wedding day. "This is where our story began," she said. "Two people in love, starting their life together with hopes and dreams for the future." The next few slides showed happy moments from their early marriage holidays, vacations, Juliet's birth, family gatherings. The crowd was smiling and nodding, clearly enjoying the sweet tribute. "But every marriage has its challenges," Elizabeth continued, clicking to the next slide. "And sometimes people make choices that change everything." The new slide showed bank statements highlighting money transfers to Isabella and Carmen, with amounts circled in red. For example, when your husband gives your rent money to his sisters instead of paying your bills. The crowd was starting to look uncomfortable, sensing that something was wrong. Alexander was staring at the screen in horror, realizing what was happening. "Or when your husband comes home at 6 a.m. with lipstick on his collar," Elizabeth said, clicking to a slide showing photos of Alexander and Rebecca leaving a hotel together. These photos were taken last Tuesday morning. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Rebecca looked like she wanted to disappear, while Alexander stood frozen in place, his face white with shock. "But the real surprise," Elizabeth continued, "is finding out that your husband and his sisters are involved in a multi-million-dollar fraud operation." The next slide showed documents from Isabella and Carmen's rental scam, with fake social security numbers and fraudulent loan applications clearly visible. Mr. Henderson was now standing up, his face red with anger. "Alexander, what is the meaning of this?" "And finally," Elizabeth said, clicking to the last slide, "when your husband beats you in front of your 8-year-old daughter because you won't participate in his criminal activities." The final slide showed the photo Elizabeth had taken of her bruised face, along with the hospital report documenting her injuries. The silence in the room was deafening. Alexander was shaking his head frantically, trying to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Rebecca had tears streaming down her face, and several of Alexander's co-workers were pulling out their phones to take pictures of the presentation. "So this is my tribute to my husband Alexander," Elizabeth said, her voice steady and clear. "A man who chose his criminal family and his mistress over his wife and daughter. I hope you've all enjoyed getting to know the real Alexander Johnson." Elizabeth turned off the projector and walked calmly toward the exit, leaving chaos in her wake. Alexander ran after her, grabbing her arm in the hotel lobby. "Elizabeth, what have you done?" he screamed. "You've destroyed everything. My career, my reputation, everything." "No, Alexander," Elizabeth said, pulling her arm free. "You destroyed everything the moment you decided to hit me. I just made sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." "This isn't over," Alexander said, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you can humiliate me and get away with it? You have no idea what you've just started." "Actually, I do," Elizabeth said calmly. "I know exactly what I've started and I know exactly how it's going to end. You and your sisters are going to pay for everything you've done to me and Juliet." As Elizabeth walked away, she could hear Alexander's phone ringing with calls from his co-workers and supervisors. By Monday morning, everyone at his company would know about his affair, his domestic violence, and his involvement in his sister's criminal activities. But this was just the beginning. Elizabeth had dealt the first blow, but she had much more planned for Alexander and his sisters. They had underestimated her for the last time. The war was far from over, and Elizabeth was just getting started. The weekend following the Christmas party was a blur of phone calls, text messages, and desperate attempts by Alexander to control the damage Elizabeth had caused. He had been calling her constantly, alternating between rage and pleading, but Elizabeth had blocked his number and was communicating with him only through Linda, who had volunteered to be her intermediary. "He's losing his mind," Linda reported on Saturday morning as Elizabeth helped with the breakfast rush at the diner. "He's been calling here every hour, demanding to know where you are and when you're coming home. I told him you're staying with friends until further notice." "Good," Elizabeth said, flipping pancakes with a satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. "Let him sweat. Meanwhile, I have more work to do." Elizabeth had spent Friday night and Saturday morning executing the next phase of her plan. Tony had introduced her to a contact at the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency who was very interested in the evidence she had gathered about Isabella and Carmen's operation. She had also been in touch with the Department of Social Services about the welfare fraud she suspected they were committing. But the most satisfying part of her revenge was about to unfold. Mrs. Rodriguez had been busy over the weekend, and she had gathered information that would destroy Isabella and Carmen's entire operation. "Mija, you need to see this," Mrs. Rodriguez said, appearing at the diner with a thick folder under her arm. "I've been watching those sisters like a hawk and I found out something very interesting." Elizabeth took a break from work to sit with Mrs. Rodriguez in a corner booth. The older woman opened her folder to reveal dozens of photographs, documents, and handwritten notes. "I called my niece who works at the county recorder's office," Mrs. Rodriguez explained. "Those houses that Isabella and Carmen claim to own? They don't own any of them. They're renting them from other people and then subletting them illegally." Elizabeth stared at the documents, feeling a surge of excitement. "So they're running subletting scams too? It gets better. I also found out that they've been claiming to be single mothers on their welfare applications, but Isabella has been married to the same man for 3 years. His name is Miguel Santos and he's been living in her house the whole time." "How did you find that out?" Mrs. Rodriguez grinned. "I have my ways. Let's just say that the mailman and I have become very good friends, and he's noticed some interesting patterns in their mail delivery." Elizabeth looked through the photographs Mrs. Rodriguez had taken, which showed Miguel Santos entering and leaving Isabella's house at various times, clearly living there as a resident rather than a visitor. "This is perfect," Elizabeth said. "Between this and the evidence Tony gathered, we can prove they're committing welfare fraud, rental fraud, and probably immigration fraud too." "There's more," Mrs. Rodriguez said, pulling out another set of documents. "I found out that Carmen has been using 3 different social security numbers for different benefits applications. She's been collecting unemployment benefits under one name while running the rental business under another name." Elizabeth could hardly believe what she was hearing. Isabella and Carmen had been running an incredibly sophisticated criminal operation, but they had been sloppy about covering their tracks. Now that Elizabeth knew what to look for, their entire scheme was falling apart. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you're amazing. How can I ever thank you?" "You can thank me by making sure these women get what they deserve. They've been stealing from hardworking people and giving our neighborhood a bad name. It's time for them to pay." Elizabeth spent the rest of Saturday organizing all the evidence she had gathered and preparing to turn it over to the authorities. She had documentation of rental fraud, welfare fraud, identity theft, and immigration violations. She also had proof that Alexander had been knowingly participating in their criminal activities by helping them launder money through his bank accounts. On Sunday morning, Elizabeth received a call from Tony with more good news. "The FBI raided 3 of their properties yesterday," he reported. "They found exactly what we expected: multiple undocumented immigrants living in overcrowded conditions and paying cash rent to Isabella and Carmen." "Were they arrested?" "Not yet, but warrants have been issued. They're probably going to be picked up tomorrow morning. I also have some news about Alexander. His company has suspended him pending an investigation into his involvement with the fraud operation." Elizabeth felt a deep satisfaction hearing about Alexander's professional downfall. After years of him criticizing her job at the diner and acting like he was so much better than her, it was poetic justice that his white-collar career was crumbling while she was thriving. "There's something else," Tony continued. "Rebecca Martinez has been fired from the company. Apparently, she was using company resources to help Isabella and Carmen create fake documents for their rental applications." Elizabeth hadn't expected that Rebecca was directly involved in the criminal activities, but it made sense. She had probably been helping them in exchange for Alexander's affection, not realizing that she was implicating herself in federal crimes. "So all 3 of them are going down together?" Elizabeth said. "Perfect. It gets better. I found out that Isabella and Carmen have been bragging to people in their community about having a stupid American wife who was helping them with their business. They've been making fun of you for months, telling people how easy it was to manipulate you." Elizabeth felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly replaced by satisfaction. They had underestimated her completely, and now they were going to pay the price for their arrogance. Monday morning brought the news Elizabeth had been waiting for. Isabella and Carmen were arrested at their respective homes at 6 a.m., charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The local news stations covered the story extensively, describing it as a major immigration fraud ring that had been operating for several years. Elizabeth watched the coverage from Linda's diner, feeling a mixture of triumph and relief. The reporter standing outside Isabella's house described how the sisters had been living lavishly while stealing from both the government and vulnerable immigrants who trusted them. The investigation was triggered by a tip from a concerned citizen, the reporter said, who provided authorities with extensive documentation of the fraud operation. Elizabeth smiled, knowing she was the concerned citizen who had brought down their entire scheme. But she wasn't done yet. She still had one more surprise for Alexander. Around noon, Alexander finally appeared at the diner, looking haggard and desperate. He had clearly been drinking, and his usually perfect appearance was disheveled and unkempt. "Elizabeth, please," he said, approaching her table where she was having lunch. "We need to talk. Everything is falling apart and I need your help." "I'm sorry, Alexander, but I don't think I can help you," Elizabeth said calmly. "I'm not involved in your business activities, remember? You made that very clear." "Elizabeth, please. Isabella and Carmen have been arrested, I've been suspended from work, and Rebecca won't even talk to me anymore. I don't have anyone else to turn to." Elizabeth looked at him with pity. "You had me, Alexander. You had a wife who loved you and a daughter who adored you. But you chose your criminal family and your mistress instead." "I never meant for any of this to happen," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "I was just trying to help my sisters and then things got out of hand. I didn't know they were doing anything illegal." "You didn't know?" Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "You helped them launder money, Alexander. You gave them our rent money to fund their operation. You knew exactly what they were doing." Alexander's face crumpled. "What do you want from me? What do I have to do to fix this?" "You can't fix this, Alexander. You had a wife who loved you and a daughter who adored you. But you chose your criminal family and your mistress instead." "I never meant for any of this to happen," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "I was just trying to help my sisters and then things got out of hand. I didn't know they were doing anything illegal." "You didn't know?" Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "You helped them launder money, Alexander. You gave them our rent money to fund their operation. You knew exactly what they were doing." Alexander's face crumpled. "What do you want from me? What do I have to do to fix this?" "You can't fix this, Alexander. You destroyed our marriage, you traumatized our daughter, and you participated in criminal activities that hurt innocent people. There's no going back from that. So what happens now?" Elizabeth stood up and gathered her things. "Now you face the consequences of your choices. Isabella and Carmen are going to prison, Rebecca has been fired and will probably be charged as an accessory, and you're going to have to figure out how to rebuild your life without any of them. What about Juliet? She's my daughter too." "Juliet is going to be fine," Elizabeth said firmly. "She's going to grow up knowing that her mother was strong enough to protect her from people who would hurt her. As for you, you'll have to earn the right to be part of her life again." As Elizabeth walked away, she could hear Alexander calling after her, but she didn't turn around. She had said everything she needed to say and she had done everything she needed to do. Alexander and his sisters had been completely destroyed, their criminal empire brought down by the woman they had considered too weak and stupid to fight back. But Elizabeth's revenge wasn't complete yet. She still had one more surprise in store, something that would ensure that Alexander understood exactly who he had been dealing with all along. The final phase of her plan was about to begin. 2 weeks after Isabella and Carmen's arrest, Elizabeth sat in Marcus Williams' law office, reviewing the divorce papers that would officially end her marriage to Alexander. Marcus was an old friend from high school who had become a successful family law attorney, and he had been more than happy to help Elizabeth when she reached out to him. "I have to say, Elizabeth, this is the most comprehensive divorce case I've ever handled," Marcus said, adjusting his glasses as he looked through the mountain of evidence she had provided. Between the domestic violence documentation, the adultery evidence, and the criminal conspiracy charges, Alexander doesn't have a leg to stand on. "Good," Elizabeth said firmly. "I want to make sure he can't come back and try to take Juliet away from me, or claim any rights to property or assets. With this evidence, that's not going to be a problem. In fact, you're going to get everything: full custody of Juliet, the house, his pension, and probably alimony payments if he ever gets out of prison." Elizabeth felt a surge of satisfaction. After years of Alexander controlling their finances and making her feel like she was dependent on him, she was going to end up with everything while he ended up with nothing. "Speaking of prison," Marcus continued, "I have some updates on the criminal cases. Isabella and Carmen are both facing 25 years in federal prison. Their lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution isn't interested in being lenient. What about Alexander? He's been indicted on money laundering charges, conspiracy to commit fraud, and accessory to immigration violations. He's looking at 15 to 20 years. His lawyer is also trying to negotiate a plea deal, but given the extensive evidence against him, he's not in a good position to bargain. Elizabeth nodded, feeling a deep sense of justice. Alexander and his sisters had thought they were so smart, running their criminal operation while looking down on honest, hard-working people like her. Now they were going to spend the best years of their lives in prison. There's something else, Marcus said, pulling out another folder. I've been working with Tony to trace Alexander's assets, and we found something interesting. He's been hiding money in offshore accounts, probably planning to use it to flee the country if things got too hot. How much money? Almost $200,000. Money that should have been going to support you and Juliet, but instead was being hidden away for his escape plan. Elizabeth felt a flash of anger. While she had been working double shifts at the diner and worrying about paying bills, Alexander had been secretly stashing away hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was just another example of how little he had cared about his family. Can we get that money back? Absolutely. In fact, we can do better than that. I've been working with a contact at the IRS, and it turns out that Alexander never declared any of this income on his tax returns. He owes the government over $50,000 in back taxes, plus penalties and interest. Marcus opened another folder and showed Elizabeth a document that made her smile. This is a court order freezing all of Alexander's assets, including the offshore accounts. Every penny he has is now under government control, and it's going to be used to pay his legal fees, his back taxes, and his restitution to the victims of his fraud scheme. So he's going to be completely broke? Completely broke and completely ruined. By the time this is over, he'll be lucky if he has enough money for a bus ticket when he gets out of prison. Elizabeth felt a deep satisfaction hearing about Alexander's financial ruin. He had always been so proud of his money and his success, looking down on her for working at a diner and making her feel like she was worthless. Now he was going to experience what it felt like to have nothing. What about Rebecca? She's been charged as an accessory to the fraud scheme, but she's cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. She's also been fired from her job and will probably never work in her field again. Elizabeth felt a twinge of satisfaction about Rebecca's downfall too. The woman had knowingly participated in destroying Elizabeth's marriage and had helped criminals defraud innocent people. She deserved whatever punishment she got. There's one more thing, Marcus said, pulling out a final document. I've been working with your Aunt Patricia on something special. Elizabeth's Aunt Patricia was her mother's sister, a successful businesswoman who had always been supportive of Elizabeth but had lost touch with her after Alexander had discouraged their relationship. Patricia had reached out after hearing about the divorce, offering to help in any way she could. What kind of special thing? Well, it turns out that Alexander's prized possession, his collection of vintage cars, is being auctioned off to pay his legal fees. Your Aunt Patricia has agreed to buy the entire collection and then donate it to a charity auction. Elizabeth laughed out loud. Alexander's car collection was his pride and joy, something he had spent years building and had never let her or Juliet even touch. The idea of it being sold to pay for his legal defense was incredibly satisfying. But that's not the best part, Marcus continued. Your Aunt Patricia has also agreed to hire you as the manager of her new community foundation. It's a full-time position with excellent benefits, and it will give you the financial security you need to rebuild your life. Elizabeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. After years of struggling to make ends meet while Alexander criticized her job and made her feel worthless, she was finally going to have the career and financial stability she had always dreamed of. Marcus, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You don't need to thank me, Elizabeth. You did all the hard work. You gathered the evidence, you built the case, and you had the courage to fight back against people who thought they could destroy you. I just helped you make it official. As Elizabeth left Marcus's office, she felt a sense of closure that she hadn't experienced in years. Alexander and his sisters were going to prison, their criminal empire had been destroyed, and she was finally free to build the life she wanted for herself and Juliet. But there was still one more thing she needed to do. She wanted to make sure that Alexander understood exactly what had happened to him and who was responsible for his downfall. She wanted him to know that the woman he had beaten and humiliated had been the architect of his complete destruction. That afternoon, Elizabeth drove to the county jail where Alexander was being held pending trial. She had arranged to meet with him in the visiting room, ostensibly to discuss Juliet's welfare but actually to deliver her final message. Alexander looked terrible when he appeared on the other side of the glass partition. He had lost weight, his hair was disheveled, and he had dark circles under his eyes. The man who had once been so proud of his appearance now looked like a broken shell of his former self. "Elizabeth," he said, picking up the phone with shaking hands. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I came to talk about Juliet," Elizabeth said, her voice steady and calm. "I want you to know that she's doing very well. She's happy, she's healthy, and she's already starting to forget about the night you hit me in front of her." Alexander's face crumpled. "Elizabeth, I'm so sorry about that night. I was drunk, I was angry, and I did something unforgivable. I know I can't take it back, but I want you to know that I regret it every single day." "I know you do, Alexander. But regret doesn't change what happened. Is there any chance at all that we could work things out? I know I made mistakes, but I love you and Juliet more than anything in the world." Elizabeth looked at him with pity. "Alexander, do you have any idea what you're facing? You're going to prison for 15 to 20 years. Isabella and Carmen are going to prison for 25 years. Rebecca has lost her career and will probably go to prison too. Your entire life has been destroyed." "I know, but maybe if I cooperate with the prosecutors, if I help them understand that I was just trying to help my sisters." "You still don't get it, do you?" Elizabeth said, leaning forward. "You think this was all some terrible accident, some misunderstanding that got out of hand. But it wasn't, Alexander. This was deliberate. This was planned. This was revenge." Alexander stared at her, confusion evident on his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything that has happened to you and your sisters was orchestrated by me. I'm the one who gathered the evidence against Isabella and Carmen. I'm the one who turned them into the FBI. I'm the one who exposed your affair and your criminal activities at the Christmas party. I'm the one who traced your hidden assets and reported you to the IRS." Alexander's face went white. "You? But you're just what, Alexander? Just a stupid waitress who couldn't possibly outsmart you and your criminal family? Just a weak woman who would take whatever abuse you dished out? Just a pathetic wife who would stand by while you stole from her and cheated on her?" Alexander was staring at her in shock, finally understanding what had happened to him. "You made the mistake of underestimating me, Alexander." Retry. CC. Continue. Edit. "And your sisters thought I was too weak and too stupid to fight back. You thought you could hit me, steal from me, cheat on me, and humiliate me, and I would just take it like a good little victim." Alexander's hands were shaking as he gripped the phone. "Elizabeth, you don't understand. Isabella and Carmen, they convinced me that what we were doing was just helping people. I didn't know it was illegal." "Stop lying, Alexander. You knew exactly what you were doing. You helped them launder money through your bank accounts. You gave them our rent money to fund their operation. You participated in creating fake documents. You knew it was all illegal, and you did it anyway because you thought you were smarter than everyone else. But why?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you destroy everything? We could have worked things out." Elizabeth stood up, preparing to leave. "You destroyed everything the moment you decided to hit me in front of our daughter. Everything that happened after that was just consequences. I simply made sure that the consequences were proportional to the damage you caused." "Elizabeth, please," Alexander begged. "I'll do anything to make this right. I'll confess to everything, I'll cooperate with the prosecutors, I'll give them information about other people involved in the operation." "It's too late for that, Alexander. You're going to prison and you're going to stay there for a very long time. When you get out, I'll be successful and happy, Juliet will be a grown woman who barely remembers you, and you'll be a broken old man with nothing left." As Elizabeth walked away from the jail, she felt a profound sense of peace. Alexander finally understood what had happened to him and who was responsible. He would spend the next 15 to 20 years in prison thinking about how he had underestimated the woman he had tried to destroy. That evening, Elizabeth picked up Juliet from school and took her out for ice cream to celebrate some good news. "Mommy got a new job," she told her daughter. "A really good job that's going to let us have our own house and not worry about money anymore." Juliet's face lit up. "Does that mean we don't have to live with Miss Linda anymore?" "We can stay with Miss Linda as long as we want, but soon we'll have our own place. Just you and me." "What about Daddy?" Elizabeth chose her words carefully. "Daddy made some bad choices, sweetheart. He's going to be away for a while, but that doesn't mean he doesn't love you." Juliet nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Can we get a dog when we move to our new house?" "Maybe," Elizabeth said, smiling at her daughter's resilience. "We'll see." As they sat in the ice cream shop, Elizabeth reflected on everything that had happened over the past few months. She had gone from being a victim of domestic violence to being the architect of one of the most comprehensive revenge schemes she had ever heard of. Alexander and his sisters had lost everything: their freedom, their money, their reputations, and their futures. But more importantly, Elizabeth had gained everything: her independence, her self-respect, her financial security, and her daughter's safety. She had proven to herself and everyone else that she was stronger and smarter than anyone had given her credit for. The legal web she had woven around Alexander and his sisters was complete, and there was no escape for any of them. They would spend years in prison thinking about the woman they had underestimated, the woman who had brought down their entire criminal empire with nothing but intelligence, determination, and patience. Elizabeth's revenge was almost complete. There was just one more phase of her plan to execute, one final message to send that would ensure her victory was total and permanent. 3 months after the arrests, Elizabeth was settling into her new life with a satisfaction that grew stronger every day. She had started her position as manager of Aunt Patricia's Community Foundation, a job that not only paid well but also gave her the opportunity to help other women who were in situations similar to what she had experienced. Juliet was thriving in her new school, making friends and showing no signs of trauma from her father's abuse. She rarely asked about Alexander anymore, and when she did, it was with the casual curiosity of a child rather than the desperate longing Elizabeth had feared. But Elizabeth wasn't done with Alexander yet. She had been monitoring his situation through Marcus, and she had learned that he was getting desperate. His sisters had both pleaded guilty and received 20-year sentences. Rebecca had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and Alexander was facing the prospect of going to trial alone with no allies and no leverage. That's when Elizabeth decided to spring her final trap. She had Marcus arrange a meeting with Alexander's court-appointed attorney, an overworked public defender named Jim Peterson, who was clearly in over his head with the complexity of the case. "Ms. Johnson," Peterson said when they met in his cramped office, "I understand you might be willing to help your husband's case in some way?" "I might be," Elizabeth said carefully. "I've been thinking about Juliet, and how difficult it will be for her to grow up with her father in prison for 20 years. If there was some way to reduce his sentence, it might be better for everyone." Peterson leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of help are you thinking about?" "Well, I know that Alexander was involved in his sister's operation, but I also know that they manipulated him. If he was willing to cooperate fully with the prosecution and provide information about other people involved in similar schemes, maybe we could negotiate a reduced sentence." "That's possible," Peterson said. "But Alexander has been insisting that he doesn't know anything about other operations." "That's because he's scared," Elizabeth said. "He's afraid that if he talks, he'll put himself in danger. But if I could convince him that it's the right thing to do for Juliet's sake, he might be willing to open up." Peterson was practically salivating at the possibility of reducing his client's sentence. "What would you need from me?" "I'd need to meet with Alexander privately, without any recording devices or monitoring. He needs to trust that our conversation is completely confidential, or he'll never tell me the truth about what he knows." Peterson hesitated. "That's highly irregular. The prosecution would want any information he provides to be officially recorded." "I understand that," Elizabeth said. "But first I need to convince him to talk at all. Once he agrees to cooperate, then we can arrange for official statements and testimony. But this first conversation needs to be private." After some negotiation, Peterson arranged for Elizabeth to have an unmonitored visit with Alexander in a private room at the jail. He believed he was facilitating a breakthrough that would save his client from a life sentence. He had no idea he was helping Elizabeth execute the final phase of her revenge. The meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon in a small conference room typically used for attorney-client meetings. Alexander looked even worse than he had during their previous visit, with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes. Prison was clearly taking a toll on him both physically and mentally. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jim told me you might be able to help me. I can't believe you would do that after everything that's happened." "I'm not doing it for you, Alexander," Elizabeth said, sitting across from him at the small table. "I'm doing it for Juliet. She deserves to have a father who might be able to be part of her life someday." Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "I would do anything to be able to see Juliet again. Anything at all." "I know you would," Elizabeth said gently. "That's why I'm here. I think there might be a way to reduce your sentence significantly, but you have to be completely honest with me about everything you know." "I've told them everything already. I helped Isabella and Carmen with their rental business, I transferred money for them, I even helped them create some documents. But I swear I didn't know it was illegal. Elizabeth shook her head. Alexander, you're still lying to me. The prosecution has financial records showing money transfers that go far beyond what you've admitted to. They have evidence of your involvement in other schemes that you haven't even been charged with yet. Alexander's face went pale. What other schemes? The embezzlement from your company, for one thing. Did you really think no one would notice that you were stealing from client accounts to fund Isabella and Carmen's operation? Alexander was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. Finally, he looked up at Elizabeth with defeated eyes. How did you know about that? Because I've been investigating you for months, Alexander. I know about the money you stole from Hoffman Industries. I know about the fake invoices you created to cover your tracks. I know about the client accounts you manipulated. I know everything. Elizabeth, you have to understand, I was in too deep. Isabella and Carmen said they needed more money to expand the business, and they promised they would pay it all back with interest. I was trying to help my family. How much did you steal, Alexander? Over 3 years? Maybe $400,000. Elizabeth felt a surge of satisfaction. Alexander had just confessed to embezzling nearly $500,000 from his employer, a crime that carried a sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison all by itself. Who else knew about the embezzlement? No one. I did it all myself. I was the only one with access to those accounts. What about Rebecca? Didn't she help you cover your tracks? Alexander hesitated, then nodded slowly. She helped me create some of the fake invoices. But she didn't know what they were really for. I told her it was just creative accounting to help clients minimize their tax burden. Elizabeth was recording everything on her phone, hidden in her purse. Alexander had no idea that he was providing her with a complete confession to federal embezzlement charges. Alexander, if you're willing to confess to the embezzlement and cooperate with the prosecution, they might be willing to reduce your sentence on the other charges. But you have to tell them everything, every detail, every person involved, every dollar you stole. You really think that would help? I think it's your only chance to see Juliet before she's grown up. Otherwise, you're looking at 40 years in prison between the fraud charges and the embezzlement charges. Alexander broke down completely, sobbing into his hands. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to help my sisters, and everything spiraled out of control. I know, Elizabeth said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. But now you have a chance to make it right. You can take responsibility for what you've done and help the prosecution recover the money you stole. It's the right thing to do. Will you bring Juliet to see me if I cooperate? If you tell the complete truth and help recover every penny you stole, then yes. I'll bring Juliet to see you. Alexander nodded frantically. I'll do it. I'll tell them everything. I'll cooperate completely. Elizabeth left the jail with a recording of Alexander confessing to embezzling $400,000 from his company, along with details about how he had covered his tracks and who had helped him. She drove straight to the FBI field office and turned the recording over to the agents handling his case. This is exactly what we needed, Agent Martinez told her after listening to the recording. We suspected there was embezzlement involved, but we couldn't prove it without his confession. This recording gives us everything we need to file additional charges. What kind of sentence is he looking at now? With the fraud charges and the embezzlement charges combined? Probably 35 to 40 years. He'll be in his 70s when he gets out. Elizabeth felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Alexander would spend the rest of his productive adult life in prison, thinking about the woman he had underestimated and the daughter he would never really know. But the best part was that he had walked into her trap willingly, believing that she was trying to help him. He had confessed to crimes that the prosecution couldn't prove, provided evidence of additional criminal activity, and sealed his own fate, all because he thought his victim was still naive enough to want to save him. A week later, Alexander was charged with additional counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering. His sentence was enhanced to 42 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. His sisters received additional charges as co-conspirators in the embezzlement scheme, extending their sentences to life without parole. Rebecca Martinez, who had been facing 5 years for her role in the document fraud, was now facing 15 years for her participation in the embezzlement scheme. Elizabeth's final trap had worked perfectly. She had convinced Alexander to confess to crimes that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life, and he had done it believing that she was trying to help him. The woman Alexander had beaten and humiliated had orchestrated his complete and total destruction, and he had been too arrogant and too desperate to see it coming. Elizabeth's revenge was finally complete. 6 months had passed since Alexander's final sentencing, and Elizabeth barely recognized her own life. She stood in the kitchen of her new house, a beautiful 3-bedroom home that Aunt Patricia had helped her by making breakfast for Juliet and herself while sunlight streamed through windows that actually belonged to them. "Mommy, can I invite Jessica over for a sleepover this weekend?" Juliet asked, bouncing in her chair as she ate her cereal. At 9 years old, she had grown taller and more confident, her personality blooming in ways Elizabeth had never seen before. "Of course, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, smiling at her daughter's excitement. "We can make pizza and watch movies." Juliet had never asked to have friends over when they lived with Alexander. The house had always been tense and unwelcoming, filled with the threat of Alexander's explosive temper. Now their home was filled with laughter, music, and the kind of peace that Elizabeth had thought was only possible in other people's lives. The doorbell rang and Elizabeth opened it to find Mrs. Rodriguez holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing a bright smile. "Good morning, Mija," the older woman said, stepping inside with the familiarity of someone who had become like family. "I brought these for Juliet's lunchbox." Mrs. Rodriguez had become an unofficial grandmother to Juliet, spending her afternoons helping with homework and sharing stories about her own grandchildren who lived across the country. She had also become one of Elizabeth's closest friends and confidants. "Any word from that lawyer of yours?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked as they sat in the living room while Juliet got ready for school. "Marcus called yesterday with the final update," Elizabeth said. "Alexander's appeals were all denied. He's going to serve the full 42 years. "Good," Mrs. Rodriguez said with satisfaction. "And what about those sisters of his?" "Life sentences. They'll die in prison." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "They got exactly what they deserved. You did a good thing, Elizabeth. Not just for yourself and Juliet, but for all the people they were hurting." Elizabeth felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that Isabella and Carmen would never again be able to prey on vulnerable immigrants or defraud government programs. The FBI had used the evidence she provided to shut down similar operations across 3 states, and dozens of other criminals had been arrested as a result of her investigation. After dropping Juliet at school, Elizabeth drove to her office at the Patricia Williams Community Foundation. The foundation focused on helping women escape domestic violence and rebuild their lives, and Elizabeth had thrown herself into the work with a passion that surprised even her. "Good morning, boss," called out Maria Santos, the foundation's program coordinator and another survivor of domestic violence who had become one of Elizabeth's closest friends. "We've got 3 new applications this morning, and Linda wants to talk to you about expanding the job training program." Linda had joined the foundation as a volunteer counselor after selling her diner to a young couple who shared her commitment to community service. She spent her days helping other women develop the practical skills they needed to support themselves and their children. "Also," Maria continued, "there's a reporter from the city paper who wants to interview you about the foundation's success. Apparently, we're being considered for some kind of state award." Elizabeth shook her head. "You know I don't like publicity. Can you handle the interview instead?" "Elizabeth, you need to start taking credit for what you've accomplished here. In 6 months, you've helped 37 women leave abusive relationships and start new lives. You've created job training programs, housing assistance, legal aid clinics. You've built something amazing." Elizabeth knew Maria was right, but she still felt uncomfortable with attention and praise. After years of Alexander telling her she was worthless and incompetent, she was still adjusting to the reality that she was actually very good at what she did. "Speaking of accomplishments," Maria said with a grin, "there's someone here to see you. He's been waiting in your office for about 10 minutes. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "He? A very handsome he if you want my opinion. Says his name is Dr. Michael Chin, and he's working on some kind of research project about community support programs." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She had met Dr. Chin a month earlier at a conference about domestic violence prevention, and they had spent hours talking about their shared passion for helping survivors rebuild their lives. He was a psychologist who worked with trauma victims, and he had impressed Elizabeth with his intelligence, compassion, and gentle sense of humor. She found him in her office, studying the wall of thank you letters from women the foundation had helped. He turned when she entered, and his face lit up with a warm smile that made Elizabeth's stomach flutter. "Elizabeth, thank you for seeing me without an appointment," he said. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd take a chance." "It's always good to see you, Michael," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice casual. "How's the research project going?" "That's actually why I'm here. I've been analyzing the data from programs like yours across the state, and what you've accomplished here is remarkable. Your success rate for long-term independence is nearly double the state average." Elizabeth felt a flush of pride. We have an amazing team. You have amazing leadership, Michael corrected. I was wondering if you might be interested in collaborating on a larger study. There are federal grants available for innovative approaches to domestic violence prevention, and I think your model could be scaled up to help thousands of women. As they discussed the possibilities, Elizabeth found herself drawn to Michael's enthusiasm and expertise. He understood the work she was doing in a way that few people could, and he treated her as an equal partner rather than someone who needed to be managed or controlled. There's something else, Michael said as their meeting was winding down. I know this might be forward of me, but I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me this weekend. Not for business, just because I'd like to spend more time getting to know you. Elizabeth felt a flutter of panic. She hadn't been on a date since before she married Alexander, and the idea of opening herself up to another relationship was terrifying. But there was something about Michael that made her feel safe and valued in a way she had never experienced before. I would like that, she said, surprising herself with her answer. But I should tell you that I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she comes first in everything I do. I would expect nothing less, Michael said with a smile. Actually, I was hoping to meet Juliet sometime. I think she and I would get along well. As Elizabeth watched Michael leave, she felt a sense of possibility that she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since her divorce, she was beginning to think that maybe she could have it all: a career she loved, a daughter who was thriving, and perhaps even a relationship with someone who saw her strength instead of trying to diminish it. That evening, Elizabeth picked up Juliet from her after-school program and took her to their favorite restaurant to celebrate some good news. Guess what, sweetheart? Elizabeth said as they shared a pizza. Mommy's work is going so well that we might be able to help even more families, and there might be an article about us in the newspaper. That's awesome, Mom, Juliet said, beaming with pride. Will they take our picture? Maybe. Would you like that? Juliet nodded enthusiastically. I want everyone to know how smart and strong my mom is. Elizabeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. After years of Alexander telling her she was worthless, her daughter saw her as smart and strong. After years of working at a diner and being looked down on, she was running a successful foundation and being recognized for her achievements. Juliet, there's something else I want to talk to you about. There's a very nice man named Dr. Chin who works with people like Mommy does, and he's asked us to have dinner with him this weekend. How would you feel about that? Juliet considered this seriously. Is he like Daddy? No, sweetheart. He's nothing like Daddy. He's kind and gentle, and he helps people instead of hurting them. Okay then. I'd like to meet him. As they drove home, Elizabeth reflected on how much their lives had changed. A year ago, she had been a frightened, abused woman living in fear and financial instability. Now she was successful, independent, and possibly on the verge of finding love again with someone who respected and valued her. Alexander was spending his days in a federal prison, probably wondering how the weak, stupid woman he had underestimated had managed to destroy his entire life. Isabella and Carmen were in maximum security facilities, serving life sentences for crimes Elizabeth had exposed. Rebecca Martinez was in a women's federal prison, her career and reputation ruined forever. But Elizabeth wasn't thinking about any of them anymore. She was thinking about the future she was building with Juliet, the work she was doing to help other women, and the possibility that the best years of her life were still ahead of her. Her revenge had been complete and devastating, but more importantly, her recovery had been total and transformative. She had proven to herself and everyone else that she was stronger than anyone had ever imagined. 1 year after Alexander's sentencing, Elizabeth stood before a packed auditorium at the state capitol, accepting the governor's award for community service on behalf of the Patricia Williams Community Foundation. Juliet sat in the front row wearing her best dress, beaming with pride as her mother delivered her acceptance speech to an audience of lawmakers, community leaders, and fellow advocates. This award belongs to every woman who has found the courage to leave an abusive relationship and rebuild her life, Elizabeth said into the microphone, her voice strong and clear. It belongs to every person who has chosen to help rather than judge, to lift up rather than tear down. Most importantly, it belongs to the children who deserve to grow up in homes filled with love and respect rather than fear and violence. The audience erupted in applause, and Elizabeth caught sight of Michael in the third row, his face glowing with admiration and something deeper that had been growing between them over the past 6 months. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than passion and desperation. Juliet had taken to Michael immediately, charmed by his gentle humor and genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. He never tried to replace her father or assert authority over her. Instead, he had simply become a trusted friend who happened to make her mother smile more than she had in years. After the ceremony, Elizabeth found herself surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, all wanting to know about the foundation's success and her plans for the future. She handled the attention with grace and confidence, no longer the timid woman who had been afraid to speak up for herself. "Ms. Johnson," called out a reporter from the state's largest newspaper, "your foundation has helped over 200 women in just 18 months. What do you attribute this success to?" "We treat every woman as an individual with unique strengths and challenges," Elizabeth replied. "We don't just provide temporary shelter, we provide education, job training, legal assistance, and ongoing support. We help women build new lives, not just escape old ones. There are rumors that your own experience with domestic violence inspired you to start this work. Are you willing to comment on that?" Elizabeth had learned to handle these questions without flinching. "I am a survivor of domestic violence, and that experience taught me both how difficult it is to leave an abusive relationship and how possible it is to rebuild a life afterward. Every woman we help proves that survival is not enough, we can thrive." As the crowd began to disperse, Elizabeth noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the auditorium. It was Jim Peterson, Alexander's former attorney, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the celebration. "Ms. Johnson," he said, approaching her hesitantly, "I was wondering if I could have a word with you privately." Elizabeth's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity got the better of her. She asked Michael to keep an eye on Juliet and followed Peterson to a quiet corner of the lobby. "I know this is inappropriate," Peterson began, "but I wanted you to know that Alexander has been asking about you. He's heard about your success, about the foundation, about this award. He wanted me to reach out to you." "What does he want?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she already knew. "He wants to see Juliet. He's been in prison for over a year now, and he says he's changed. He's been participating in anger management programs, substance abuse counseling, therapy. He claims he's a different man." Elizabeth looked at Peterson with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Did you really think I would agree to that? Did you really think I would expose my daughter to him again? He's her father, Ms. Johnson. He has rights. He forfeited those rights when he chose to beat me in front of her," Elizabeth said firmly. "He forfeited them when he chose his criminal sisters and his mistress over his family. He forfeited them when he stole money that should have gone to support his child." Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your feelings, but Juliet might want to see him someday. Shouldn't that be her choice? When Juliet is 18 years old, she can make her own decisions about her father. Until then, my job is to protect her from people who might hurt her. Alexander proved that he's one of those people. He's not the same man he was, Ms. Johnson. Prison has changed him." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "Prison didn't change him, Mr. Peterson. Prison revealed who he really was underneath all the charm and manipulation. He's a violent criminal who chose to hurt the people who loved him most. That doesn't change just because he's taken some classes. What if I told you he was dying?" Elizabeth felt a momentary shock, then realized it was probably just another manipulation. "Is he dying?" Peterson hesitated. "No, but he could be. Prison is dangerous and he's not a young man anymore. Don't you think Juliet deserves a chance to know her father before it's too late? I think Juliet deserves to grow up feeling safe and loved, without the trauma of visiting her abusive father in prison. If Alexander wanted to be part of her life, he should have thought about that before he chose to destroy our family." Elizabeth turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at Peterson. "Tell Alexander that I hope he uses his time in prison to reflect on the choices he made and the people he hurt. Tell him that Juliet is happy, healthy, and thriving without him. And tell him that the woman he thought was too weak to fight back is now being honored by the governor for her strength and leadership." As Peterson walked away looking defeated, Elizabeth felt a surge of satisfaction. Even from prison, Alexander was still trying to manipulate and control her, but she was no longer the vulnerable woman who had fallen for his tactics. She was stronger now, wiser, and completely immune to his attempts at emotional blackmail. "How did it go?" Michael asked when she rejoined him and Juliet in the lobby. "Just someone trying to drag me back into the past," Elizabeth said, taking his hand. "But I'm much more interested in the future." That evening, the three of them went out for a celebration dinner at Juliet's favorite restaurant. As they shared dessert and laughed about silly jokes, Elizabeth marveled at how normal and peaceful their life had become. "Mom," Juliet said as they were driving home, "that man who wanted to talk to you, was that about Daddy?" Elizabeth was constantly amazed by her daughter's perceptiveness. "Yes, sweetheart. You wanted to know if you might want to visit Daddy in prison. Juliet was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. I don't want to see him. He scared me and he hurt you. I like our life better now. You never have to see him if you don't want to, Elizabeth assured her. That's entirely your choice. I know, Juliet said confidently. You taught me that I get to choose who I let into my life. Michael reached over and squeezed Elizabeth's hand, and she felt a wave of gratitude for everything they had built together. Juliet was growing up strong and confident, with a clear understanding of her own worth and the right to be treated with respect. Elizabeth had created a successful career helping other women find the same strength she had discovered in herself. A year later, Elizabeth stood in her office reading a newspaper article about a federal investigation that had shut down immigration fraud rings in 6 states, all based on the evidence she had provided about Isabella and Carmen's operation. Hundreds of criminals had been arrested, millions of dollars in stolen benefits had been recovered, and countless vulnerable immigrants had been protected from exploitation. The article mentioned that the investigation had been triggered by an anonymous tip from a concerned citizen. But Elizabeth knew that she had been far more than that. She had been a warrior, fighting not just for herself and Juliet but for every person who had been victimized by Alexander's criminal family. On her desk was a photo from her wedding to Michael the previous month, a small, private ceremony attended only by their closest friends and family. Juliet had served as the maid of honor, walking down the aisle with confidence and joy. In the photo, all 3 of them were laughing at something Juliet had whispered during the vows. Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a text from Tony, the private investigator who had helped her gather evidence against Alexander and his sisters. Saw the article about the fraud investigation, he wrote. You should be proud of what you accomplished. You didn't just get revenge, you got justice. Tony was right. What Elizabeth had accomplished went far beyond personal revenge. She had exposed a criminal conspiracy, helped law enforcement shut down multiple fraud operations, and used her own experience to help hundreds of other women escape abusive relationships. But perhaps most importantly, she had proven to herself that she was capable of anything she set her mind to. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up for herself had become a leader in her community. The woman who had been told she was worthless had created something of tremendous value. The woman who had been beaten down had risen up stronger than ever before. Sometimes, late at night when Juliet was asleep and Michael was working late at the hospital, Elizabeth would think about Alexander sitting in his prison cell, probably wondering how his life had gone so wrong. She hoped he understood that every day of his 42-year sentence was a direct result of his choice to hurt the people who had loved him most. But mostly, Elizabeth didn't think about Alexander at all anymore. She was too busy living the life she had built from the ashes of the one he had tried to destroy. She was too busy being happy, successful, and free. Her revenge had been perfect and complete, but her victory was something much more valuable, the knowledge that she had the strength to overcome anything and the wisdom to build something beautiful from even the most painful experiences. Alexander had tried to break her, but instead he had forged her into something unbreakable. His sisters had tried to destroy her, but instead they had given her the evidence she needed to help law enforcement protect other vulnerable people. In the end, Elizabeth's greatest victory wasn't what she had done to her enemies, it was what she had done for herself, for Juliet, and for all the women who would benefit from the strength she had discovered in her darkest hour. The weak, frightened woman Alexander had beaten was gone forever, replaced by someone who would never again allow anyone to make her feel small or worthless. Elizabeth Johnson had won the war not by becoming like her enemies, but by becoming the best version of herself. And that victory would last a lifetime.